How are you?
I'm good. Yes, I know. I think the problem is I guess I get bored easily or something because I want to do different things. But yeah, I'm doing well. It's good to visit with you guys, and now you can actually hear me.
Yes, yes, we can, and we appreciate you taking out the time. I mean, we'll jump into it. I know you're a busy man, and with such a big fight week and all this news, you're probably being pulled in many different directions. Do you want to start with what they're calling the 4-decade champion, or should we start with the face of boxing, Canelo? A lot of big news this week.
Whichever you like. We can talk about the Pacquiao Ugas fight, and that is a I'm going to actually go to it just as a fan.
Okay.
I don't have anything to do with it, and it's here in Las Vegas, so I decided to go over there and enjoy it. And of course, we wanted to see Spence and Pacquiao, but I think Pacquiao and Ugas is going to be a pretty interesting fight.
Absolutely. So I know you stay on Twitter as often as most of us boxing fans. Did you see the rhetoric about a possible Ugas injury and this picture floating around with the left bicep looking like it swallowed
like
an apple?
No.
Yeah, bicep looked like if it worked out maybe 8 months more than the other side.
The bicep
Do we know
looks
that was
like
a real photo,
an
or was
anaconda.
it?
You know, with the internet, you can't put it past Photoshop. But it is from PBC's official Twitter. It's actually not an interview. It's a video. I'll screen share it, which you won't be able to see it, but at least our viewing audience will get an idea of what it is that I'm talking about, because the video the bicep is definitely.
Yeah, I thought about the same thing, Al.
It could also be the
Photoshop video, with all the editing and stuff.
If it's a video that came from PBC, it probably isn't. I've not heard about that, but that's certainly an interesting question, and I'm sure it's going to be explored over the coming next day or so, especially as he heads into the weigh-in and everything. But what's supposed to be the nature of the injury? Just some injury to the bicep?
Well, it's not something that we know for sure, but it does look abnormally larger.
It's the Twitterverse coming up with this. Al, it just looks swollen, though. From the eye, for us, it looks swollen. But, I guess that's...
They've been snake bit with this promotion. So it would be, the way things have gone for them. And, I've talked to some of the folks that were involved. I was there last night and had dinner with some folks, and they were saying, it's just, unfortunately, they've suffered, several setbacks with everything involving this promotion. And sometimes bad luck, hits you and it keeps dogging you.
Now, Al, man, you've been in this business for so long. You've watched premium networks. Now we're on Fox. We're on streaming apps. We had Lou DiBello on not too long ago, and he tried to give his version of how you can fix boxing. What would you, if you were given the magic wand to correct things, what is the number one thing that needs to change for boxing to, I guess the phrase is be as good as it was in its golden day?
Well, there are a couple of things that obviously hold the sport back. One is the multiple champions. That's a big issue because in every other sport, we're all sports fans. And, we, with the exception of college football years ago, now we can say college football has a champion. Almost every sport, and we know who the champion is. We know who ultimately ends up winning a championship. In boxing, we don't. Because there's so many champions. So it takes that away from the casual boxing fan for sure. So that's a big issue. The other issue is, boxing makes a lot of good fights. This last year especially. The product boxing has put out there has been really pretty good, very good. But there's always fights that don't get made. And of course, the second thing is we want to see more big fights being made. The third part of that is, and I'm reticent almost to say this because I don't want it to look like I'm trying to push fighters into fighting 1,000,000 times during a year, because I don't think that's a good answer by any stretch. We don't see fighters enough to satisfy their fans and to satisfy the sport in general. If we only see a fighter twice a year, and one of those fights might not be an A fight, right? It might be an okay fight. Well, we're not really seeing his brand enough. I would love to see fighters fight 3 times a year. If everybody could fight 3 times a year, I think this sport would benefit from it. If the stars that are in the sport fought at least that many times, I think it would help the sport.
Isn't a salary cap kind of what the sport needs? Because if you want a fighter to fight 3 times a year, but he's Terrence Crawford with a 5.5 minimum or a 4.5 minimum, I mean, how do you do that without the help of pay-per-view?
Well, you don't. Yeah, I mean, well, of course, all the contracts are individually made. Yeah, as you point out, everything is. I mean, boxing is laissez-faire capitalism run amok, because there are no rules. There's no league. There's no, like you said, there's no cap. There's no anything. It's all about people making deals. And so, yeah, if you're a fighter and you make a deal and you are guaranteed that amount, each time out, then yeah, it's hard to do. But and then I guess you become a pay-per-view fighter every time. But those details and those things are up to fighters and promoters and people to figure out. If you fight 3 times a year at I don't know, 3.5 million, it's still more than fighting twice a year at 4.5 million, right? You're a little bit over, and I know you have to fight 3 times, but at the end of the day, I just think it would be beneficial for the sport if we could just see those fighters one more time a year.
Micah K. in Detroit, do you have anything for legendary Al Bernstein?
Absolutely. How you doing? I'm good. My name is Micah K. And so I wanted to know, what advice would you give, would you give a young up and coming, freelance sports journalist like myself that's in your field?
Yeah, it's funny. Somebody just said, we were just at our last fight at Carson. Somebody came up to me and Morrow as we were leaving, and they were asking essentially the same question. And what we said was kind of what you're doing right now, which is getting experience doing it, number one. And there are more outlets now than there were before, for that, because of, what we're doing right now is a perfect example of it. And to hold yourself to standards that you think are right for you, and hold yourself to standards that you think will allow you to move ahead in the business of broadcasting and or journalism. Now, especially on the internet and in a lot of places, there are not a lot of restrictions, there's a lot of times there's no set of guidelines for people. And sometimes I think it's easy for people to fall into habits and do things that aren't really going to help their career in the long run, maybe give them a little bit of instant gratification, but it doesn't help them in the long run. So I think the trick is to set guidelines for yourself and know what direction you want to go in, what you feel is appropriate, and stick to that, and to get as many reps as you can doing the thing you're doing.
Al, let me ask you, because I hope I'm not confusing you, because then that means I'm getting old. But you did do the Triller.
I did, yes.
Yes,
bro, I got so mad for you. Now, don't get me wrong. I smoke weed every day, but I feel like I felt someone turn right to you and blow a cloud of fucking smoke in your face. Yeah. I'm like, yo, he's so disrespectful. Did that bother you?
Yeah, it's interesting. That show, of course, turned out to be something a little bit more different than even they anticipated. I think it was going to be. To be perfectly candid, and I've kind of withdrawn from the Triller universe, just in general, it just wasn't the right fit. I went into that show, just to let you know, knowing that it was going to be different and fully expecting to have fun fully expecting to be much looser, which I did, and I was part of the whole idea. The problem is, somewhere along the line, to be honest, that show went off the rails, and there were a number of different things that led it there. Too many people obviously coming in there. If you are in fact getting high during a show, yes, the chances are you might not, things might go a little crazy, right? So that's what was happening. And listen, I was in television in the 80s, enough said, right? So it's not like I'm a prude, okay? You get my point. So we had fun in the 80s. But the interesting thing is that I fully expected it to be different. But at a certain point, the show kind of went off the rails. And one of the things I haven't really spoken too much publicly about it, but the Pete David incident was interesting because he was very we had a nice, before he came on the air, he was very respectful and all the rest of it. But if you look at what happened, they went to that shot of him doing that right at the time Michael Buffer was actually doing his famous line, right? So you brought Michael Buffer in to do this event, right? And at the very moment, you thought it was more propitious and a better use of your time to show Pete Davidson blowing smoke on me. I think that probably was in microcosm what the problem with that show was. And I chose to ignore it, and I've taken the high road on it. But, to me, it was just kind of, listen, I love humor. I love goofing around. As I said, I went into that show and we had a lot of fun. I thought we had about 20 minutes on that show where me and Snoop and Mario had a really good groove going. And I thought it was kind of funny and fun and good, but there was just I think they didn't know where they wanted to go on that show. I mean, this is the most I've talked about it publicly, period. So you caught me at the right moment, and now I'll probably get in trouble for something, I don't know. So I'm going to be sweeping up after you guys in a couple weeks.
Nah. But Al, I mean, looking at them, like, completely taking that out of... Well, first of all, you never said, did he make you upset? Did it make you upset?
No. I think what he did was inappropriate. It was kind of sophomoric, right? Wasn't funny. That's the point. Funny is funny. And if something is truly funny, you can make a defense of it, right? But you tell me, was that funny?
No, I got upset. I'm like, dude, this guy must not know who Al is. Like, why is he like...
he does. He did. He was very respectful in talking to me before. And that's why, and I point out, somebody either suggested he do that, because they cut to the shot of him doing it.
I get that.
That was my point about the Michael Buffer thing. Michael Buffer's there doing his announcement. They cut to that shot of all things at that moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Why would you ever cut to a shot of the announcer sitting there? No one's ever done that in the history of boxing, ever. And they did it because somebody thought that was a gag. And listen, I know on that show, part of the thing was I was kind of the straight guy and whatever, which is ironic, as I point out, given the era I grew up in. But the point is, I was on board with that. I joked around about it. We had laughs about it. It was fun. But, they just went off the rails a little bit.
Do you not regret taking that job because it's still part of history? Like, it is the first ever event of itself, and the first time Snoop commentates, the first time people actually smoke weed on TV while a boxing event. It's still kind of history.
It's going to be a story forever for me. And I like Snoop a lot. I had him on my podcast, and I get a kick out of him. He's a cool guy, and we have a really good rapport. And as I said, we had it on that show for about 20 minutes until everything went sideways. But so I don't, it wasn't the right fit for me to continue to do it unless, now they may alter, and here's another thing, they may alter their presentation. But then the funny thing is, I wasn't sure I don't know that that's going to happen. And I didn't want to keep doing shows that were exactly like that one, if that's the way it ends up being. I just didn't think it was like I say, it wasn't quite the right fit. But they may alter as they move forward. And yeah, you make a very good point. Whatever, it was the first of its kind, maybe the only of its kind, if they do alter their approach, or whatever. But so yeah, I don't feel tortured over doing it. Listen, the reaction on Twitter was funny. At first, it was, and on the social media in general. My son, who's 23, was better at monitoring all social media, but I was looking at Twitter while I was on the show and a little bit after. So first, it was, wow, that was funny. This is fun that he's doing this, right? And that lasted about 30 minutes into the show. Then it was, oh my God, poor Al. And then at the end it was, for some people, why is he doing this?
Yeah.
So then they're like a little mad at me because I'm there, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was like an interesting kind of dynamic that that unveiled itself. Hey, listen, it is what it is. I've mostly, I think we can safely say that while I'm a freewheeling guy in life in general, and I like to have fun and all the rest of it, as a broadcaster, I mentioned guidelines or whatever. I have a code that I pretty much, like for instance, on that show, a lot of people were cursing. Well, I don't curse on TV. I just don't. Even some sportscasters on that show were cursing. I don't do it. It doesn't mean I'm telling people not to do it, but I don't do it. So I wasn't going to go there. But so I don't really regret it. It wasn't quite the right fit.
I gotta ask, man, because we've started to do commentating very low level. We've done like Buckhead Fight Club and different club shows, but I find it very hard not to curse because, like you said, being on these platforms, we have liberty and no restrictions. We go by our own guidelines. So now I'm so used to doing something. When I see that knockout, it's like the simplest thing to say is, "Oh, you know what I mean?" So how do you refrain?
And we've changed. And here's the other thing: life is different. Everything's changed. The landscape of the world has changed in terms of media, in terms of everything. So, I'm not, even me saying it, I'm not necessarily, saying that people shouldn't, but I do know that if I cursed on Showtime, they wouldn't be happy, right?
Well, no, I'm asking more advice. Like, how do you refrain? Because some of these knockouts, and you've lived through so many amazing fights. Like, how is it that you've never had that moment where it did slip out?
It's just not part of my DNA on the air. I don't think of doing that. In regular life, curse words will come out of my mouth from time to time. I'm not all the time, but certainly sometimes. Yeah, we all do. But I just have never, to me, once I get on the air, like I say, I'm pretty strict with myself about what, and this may seem really outdated and outmoded, but when I think of something to say on the air, or if I'm thinking of something to say, and if it's real, I think it's pretty clever or potentially funny, but it has risk implications, about 95% of the time, I'm not going to say it. It's just the way I'm built. My thinking is, for the chance that it is going to be clever, it is going to get me rewards. If there's a chance that that there's a lot of negativity around it, I won't do it. Now, some people, and here's the point. This is interesting. I'm not saying that's for everybody, because I know a lot of broadcasters, and we're kind of gunslingers that go around, and that's probably the way you guys feel too. You go around, you're, boom, boom, you get in a gunfight, and you move on to the next thing. So you're. I know a lot of guys in our business that are they're willing to take those chances, and that's fine. If they want to do it. I'm not necessarily geared that way.
Well, you've definitely. I guess the way you're doing it is the right way, or has been thus far, because how many years now have you been on television?
Well, shocking to say, I started in 1980, so it's been over 40 years. Luckily, I was 10 years old when I started, right? That's the good news. So now that would put me around 49, I don't know, something like that. In that vicinity. But no, I started in 1980 on the ESPN Top Ranked Boxing Series. And here's the funny, I'll tell you something funny that you guys are going to kick out of. But this speaks to this topic, which we've kind of gotten into, but maybe more than you wanted. But when I was watching when I was at ESPN early on, right at the beginning in the late 1980, 1881, there were not that many sportscasters. And I used to go to Bristol, Connecticut, and we do these shows. And Dick Vitale would be there, and I would be there. He'd be on. He'd talk boxing. Then I'd come on, maybe or basketball. I'd come on and talk boxing. Then maybe Cliff Drysdale would be there talking tennis or whatever. Well, I was in the control room, and Dick Vitale was just new doing his thing, and nobody had seen him before, right? So he was this crazy ball of energy and whatever. And I'll never forget two of the executives at ESPN who were standing there next to me in the booth with me said, "Oh, he's fun, but people are going to tire of this very soon." Well, we're 40 years later, and he's on the air, and they had this perception that maybe it was, too out there, to this or to that, which only speaks to the fact that there are so many different ways to do the craft and appeal to people. And so what has worked for me isn't necessarily, what is right for somebody else. It just worked for me. I've stayed on the air and on a couple of different major platforms, and I've been lucky enough to do the Olympics and many pay-per-view matches and other things in boxing. So thank goodness it's been beneficial for me. But again, everybody has their own way of going about it and their own way of doing it.
For sure. Do you guys have anything before I go to the questions from the people?
Yeah. How you doing? It's Alex.
How are you?
I'm pretty good, man. I want to ask you, what is the most special fight or a fight that you covered pay-per-view that you hold dear as one of those events where it was like, man, what a night. Besides the Thriller.
Pardon?
Besides Thriller.
The Thriller, right? Yeah, well, that's number one on the list. Clearly, that blows them all away. That is the only show in which we drank a toast. I drank alcohol on the show. I did do that.
I know. It was like a first, right?
So the one pay-per-view fight that kind of stands above all the rest. Well, there's kind of like two in a way. Of course, I was only a broadcaster for 5 years in 1985 when I got to do Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns. I had done the Hagler-Duran fight in 83, which was amazing to me because I was only at ESPN for 3 years, but because Top Rank did that series on ESPN and they put the pay-per-view together, me and Sal Marciano did the Hagler Duran fight. And then in 85, I was asked to do Hagler Hearns, and I did it with Al Michaels, and Kurt Gowdy was the host. So it was like, I felt like here I was 5 years into my broadcasting career, and I'm working with these guys, and I'm like, oh my, and doing this fight. And it was mind-blowing, it was just an amazing experience. And then, of course, it turned out to be the event that it was. So, and I did something at that fight that I still do all the time. When after they were introduced in the ring, I took my earphones off, my headphones off, and just wanted to experience how the crowd was reacting without that being muffled and hearing it through. And at that moment, I said, oh my God, I'm the luckiest human on the planet to be sitting at this seat doing this fight in this situation. And I now, before almost every show, take my headphones off, look around, try to feel the moment, which sometimes we don't do in life, right?
That's right.
So that fight kind of stands above. And then the other one is the Iran Barkley Roberto Duran fight in 1989. It was, Duran was being written off. Iran Barkley was looking really great as a middleweight. There was a snowstorm in Atlantic City. Nobody could get anywhere. We didn't think anybody was going to show up for the fight at the convention center. And we're there, and people are trickling in. And before you know it, by the time the fight happened, there's 8,000 people. They filled up that convention hall. And Iran Barkley and Roberto Duran created an amazing fight. I did play-by-play on that fight with Gil Clancy, who was kind of like my mentor. He was a great color analyst for CBS and a great trainer. He's a Hall of Famer, great. He was a matchmaker. He's done everything in boxing. And working with him was a joy. I did it maybe 5 or 6 times where I did play-by-play with him. And Gil Clancy is a savant when it comes to, if you go back and listen to some of his calls of fights, including that one, without it seeming like he's trying to do it, he tells you what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 minutes of the fight. So that was pretty extraordinary too.
Oh, that's so awesome. I have another question. So out of all the sports that you've covered, do you have a favorite?
Well, that's interesting. Of course, I've done way more boxing than anything else. But I will tell you what I enjoyed. I did a year or so at ESPN in after I left the Top Rank series. The Top Rank series stopped, and they made the new series, that Friday night series, and I wasn't on it, even though I was still at ESPN. A whole nother story that we won't go into. But I was there, and I was like a cotton farmer being paid not to grow cotton. I wasn't announcing live boxing, but I was doing SportsCenter and I was doing other things. And during that period of time, I did college basketball, play-by-play in college basketball, and I covered a lot of different sports for SportsCenter. And while I love boxing, and it's probably certainly number one announcing boxing, what I really loved was announcing college basketball, doing play-by-play. I got such a kick, and I was doing like the Big Sky Conference and a lot of different, but it was more fun in a way to me because I was going to these small towns and it was fascinating, and I loved doing that. So that was, I'm going to say the second to boxing, that was the most fun thing I've done. I also covered a lot of Major League Baseball for them. But doing play-by-play on college basketball was just really, really fun.
Now, are you ready, Ness? Because I want one last question. So, could you give the Boxing Voice family, especially, I want to know this since I'm a journalist, can you give us, a little secret or maybe something? What is something that you do to prepare each and every time? Let the people, because you so seasoned and you so experienced. Is it something that you do each time to get prepared that you always do?
Yeah, well, preparation is the key to everything, isn't it? It really is. Whether it's you guys interviewing me and knowing enough to ask the right questions, right? And being prepared, or it's announcing an event. And what is most important, I think, is the preparation you do for a broadcast. Some sportscasters who won't be mentioned, like Voldemort, right? In that series. Are not prepared. Just a fact, right? They haven't done the homework. They just think it's enough to sit there and have a good vocabulary and react to what's happening. That's not the case, because you need that information. You need it to illuminate. My job is to illuminate the viewer. And I need to know things they don't necessarily know, whether it's facts or anecdotes or quotes from fighters or whatever. So the way our preparation goes, just to give people an example, is we have 4 sets of notes that I can look at. Steve Farhood creates a set of notes. We have this guy, John Brister, who's a researcher in boxing, who gives us a set of notes. We interview the fighters in fighter meetings beforehand. And CompuBox, the company that does the numbers, they give us a package. So when I go and so I have at my disposal, I'm going to say about 140 pages of potential material, right? You need to use as much of that as you can. Not every bit of it's going to be beneficial. And sometimes you don't get to say all the things you have there, nor should you. But the trick is preparation. So for me, I read through all the material early in the week leading up to it. We do the interviews. The 2 days leading up to a broadcast, I take, all the material. I collated, I've read it, I've notated it, and now I make my sheet for the fights, my 2 sheets. I will go into every fight with 2 sheets of bullet points. And there's maybe 22 or 23 bullet points that I know for my role as the analyst on the show, that I know I will probably be able to use. And on the rare occasions when I haven't gone into a boxing match, and there have been a few, but not very few, with that kind of information, I have felt naked. I felt like I just wasn't, really ready to do it. So it's a process. And in the early days, man, I didn't have all this data. We used to have to hunt fighters down on the old ESPN show. We'd be chasing after them at weigh-ins and trying.
BoxRec wasn't up yet.
Pardon?
BoxRec wasn't up yet.
No, there wasn't. Oh my God, we didn't have all these resources, so it was more difficult.
All right, Mike. Did you have any other questions?
I mean, I can go on, but I'm gonna wait for the people. I love this, but I'm gonna hold out.
Turn this into a pajama party.
We'll go to
pizzas and make some prank phone calls.
Let's go,
No,
champ.
we got a few from the people, our Patreon, so we'll go to that. But Al, before we actually segue, you're doing your own show now on YouTube, right? Tell us all about it.
Yeah, the Al Bernstein Unplugged. It's a podcast and a video show, much like what you guys are doing. And, I've had a lot of fun guests on there. And part of the reason to do it was I used to interview people all the time, but in my time on Showtime, on those broadcasts, I don't get to really interview people on the air, and I like it. It's fun to do, and so I've had a lot of fun guests on, and people can find it at on YouTube, and they can find it on all the major podcast places, and it's fun. We've had a lot of fun guests on there, mostly boxing, almost all boxing guests, but some other people as well. Some actors and some other folks, and with great fighters from the past, plus obviously a lot of folks from today and broadcasters, and it's been fun. So if people want to check it out, they can go on YouTube and find it at Al Bernstein Unplugged.
Is it unfair to ask you who's your biggest guest? Because it puts you in a,
Well, I've had in different categories. I've had interesting. I've had Snoop Dogg was on. He was fun. He was a barrel of laughs. That show was really fun. That was a great show. And show. I've had all the great champions from the past, like Larry Holmes and Lennox Lewis, and all the Vinny Pazienza, and all those guys, plus many of the fighters from today. The big fighters that are on major stars today. So I've kind of mixed it up and had actors. And I had Rex Chapman on recently, who, of course, is a former basketball player at University of Kentucky, who's now the king of Twitter, right? He has all those crazy videos. So I've mixed it up to have different kinds of guests a little bit to give it more, a different flavor too. But 90% boxing folks. But I've enjoyed all the conversations I've had with people. I've interviewed a lot of the broadcasters that I've worked with, Barry Tompkins, Tim Ryan, all those people, and it's been fun.
I want to ask, Go to the next question. I'm sorry, Alex.
James Valdez from San Antonio, Texas. He says, wow, what a pleasure to have you on the show. You're like an icon in the sport of boxing. In all these years of working in this sport we love, which time was the best for you personally?
Well, I have to say the 80s because it so happened that's when I started. But honestly, and I'm not one of those guys that everything is great in the old days, and things are not good now. No, I love the period I'm in always, and I love the present. And I've said boxing in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, I've really enjoyed. I think for the most part, with a few clinker years in there, they've been really good years. So I'm not one of these guys that looks back and says, "Oh, everything in the past was better." But the '80s were a special time. There were a lot of things that just made it that way. Boxing was on free TV all the time. Now it's back on free TV some, which is good, or what's close to free TV. Even ESPN, though you pay for cable, it's basically free TV, and Fox certainly. So it was on all those afternoon fights. The 1980s just happened to be one of the 2 or 3 best, if not the best, decades the sport has ever seen. All great fighters in every way.
How was the heavyweight era at that time for you, Al?
Heavyweight was good. Larry Holmes was the champion and had many exciting fights. He was a really great champion who was vulnerable, right? So you'd see him in fights that he won many, many fights, but then he'd get knocked down by a Ronaldo Snipes or an Ernie Shavers and be close to losing. Then maybe have a fight where maybe he did lose but got a decision, and then it was. So Larry Holmes and his crew during that time in the 80s I thought were pretty entertaining. But the rest of boxing, of course, we had the Four Kings, we had Alexis Arguello and Pryor. We had so many great fighters. The 1980s was extraordinary. And it was a great time. We had fun. It was a freewheeling time. What can I tell you? It was a ball. We were going around the country. I mean, for me personally, was doing the ESPN Top Ranked Box Series. I started broadcasting in 1980. We literally did about 44 shows a year on the ESPN Top Ranked Boxing Series, which seems incredible. Maybe sometimes up to 46. It's staggering now when I think about it. I was literally on the road almost every week, and then you throw in another 5 or 6 major pay-per-view fights, right? So I was single, I was just, a road warrior. I was out there and it was a fascinating time. It was just a really, really interesting time. So I would say that was probably, overall, when you combine the boxing excellence with the time period it was in, that was probably the best time. But I have to say, I've been at it for 4 decades. Every single decade that I've been in has provided me with a lot of wonderful memories.
Let's go, champ. You feel me?
I just remembered. I wanted to ask you, and obviously if you feel uncomfortable answering due to, the broadcasting team or whatever, your affiliation to PBC, but do you think Earl's going to come back? I mean, you've been in this sport longer than us, so you've seen a few detached retinas and tears and broken orbital bones. Sure. Is he going to box again?
Yeah, well, I don't know at this juncture if medically speaking, if it's far enough into the process for them to make any kind of determination on that. Clearly, it's a serious injury. Fighters have come back from detached retinas. So
what's the most famous one?
Tear originally, it turned out it was detached. Fighters have come back and been effective. So it's certainly not out of the question. I have no inside information, about it, other than what I know from people, what people are saying. And, I've talked to people that are somewhat close to the situation, but only, but even they don't know because they don't know yet. I certainly hope for his sake that he can. And I hope this is not a career-ending injury or a career-impairing injury, because Errol Spence is a terrific fighter, big part of boxing, and has so many fans. And, we certainly don't want to see a great boxer like him not be able to perform.
What's the most famous boxer you know, other than Sugar Ray, that's come back from this sort of injury?
Ooh, let me think. Shoot. I can't remember, but I know there have been several, and a bunch. Some fighters, maybe they weren't like. Yeah, you're saying what's the most pronounced. I honestly I can't remember. There've been 3 or 4, but I just don't remember exactly who they are. But I know it has happened, and also there are some levels to that injury that even when it's detached, some are more serious than others.
Absolutely. Next question, Doomy.
Yeah, you got it from Israel Weber. He says, you've been in some iconic boxing movies. Which was the most fun to film? Also, when next in Oklahoma, lunch on me.
When next in Oklahoma, what?
Lunch on him.
Oh, how nice. Well, I love to go to Oklahoma. I've actually enjoyed going there a lot, so I hope I'm going to get back there. Yeah, I've been fortunate to be in some movies, and it's fun. I had fun doing Rocky V was funny because I went there, we were supposed to do all the boxing scenes, but they delayed the boxing scenes. I couldn't stay for them. So I didn't get to do the boxing scenes, but I was there for about 3 or 4 days. And so that press conference scene where they threw me in to ask questions was just by accident. I was there, and they had all these extras, and they had to kill time. First, they had me get up in front of all the extras and everybody, and they had them ask me questions and everything. They were trying to just entertain the people and keep them going. Then the director, Bob Avildsen, said, wait a second, why don't we throw you into the scene? We'll just give you a question to ask, So that was kind of fun. So I enjoyed doing that. My most favorite, quote-unquote, acting experience was doing the 2 Arliss episodes, which is on our competitor, HBO was, but nonetheless, back then it wasn't my competitor. And I had fun doing that episode. I don't know if you remember that show, but it was a great show that was on HBO where he played a sports agent.
Yeah.
And
Ari Gold, right? You're talking about the Entourage?
No, Arliss.
Oh, Arliss.
Entourage was a little later. Arliss preceded it, and Robert Wohl was in it. It's a really good show. If you get a chance, take a look at it.
I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah, it was funny, and it was good. Sandra Oh, who is now, of course, a famous actress from Grey's Anatomy and Killing Eve and all these things, she was on that show as a co-star of Robert Wohl, and it was a really funny show. And I did 2 episodes, and one of them was funny because it was. I was in contract. He represented me, and I was in contract negotiations, and it wasn't going well. And I said, just make sure that I don't end up doing ping pong in Da Nang. I want to. And sure enough, he screwed me and gave a big pay-per-view fight to another client of his. And the last scene of the show is me announcing a ping pong tournament in Da Nang. So but it was a cute show. It was fun. I had fun doing it.
All right, the next one's coming in from Mr. Rue in the 504. I believe that is New Orleans. And he says, what's hurting the sport of boxing?
Well, I mentioned earlier the large number of champions, the fact that we don't get to see the fighters as much. And the other thing that always dogs the sport is sometimes when major matches don't get made. And as I point out, it's easy. People focus. What happens is there's always that one match, whether it was Mayweather, Pacquiao. In this current age, it's been Crawford, Spence. When there's a certain match that hangs over boxing that isn't getting made, that they know everyone wants, the mainstream sports media that casually covers boxing uses that as a way to say boxing is not making good matches. Well, sometimes boxing is making pretty good matches, but because there's 1 or maybe 2 fights that clearly the sport can't make, it makes it look like the product isn't, doesn't include matches that people want to see. So, there's no question. Listen, boxing has a problem, especially now with, having different platforms, whether they be networks or streaming or whatever, with fighters that are endemic to their platform, promoters that have a hard time going across the street to work with each other, and we can't always make the matches that we want to see in the sport, and that is a huge problem,
The biggest
All right.
problem.
Yeah, along with the new variant, I know that COVID's really crushed the sport in a certain way, but I know with this new variant, it'll probably be affecting a lot of sports. You got Info Joe from California says, thanks for coming on TBV. In your opinion, what could be done to make boxing better? We had a lot of bad judging this year in boxing, and a lot of fights that should have been made but are not because of their other side of the street BS. Was it like this in the golden era? I guess you answered pretty much a bigger part of that question.
And to be clear, it was better in the 80s partially because some of the promoters were forced to work with each other because the networks were kind of demanding it, right? They wanted to match up these fighters, and it was like as opposed to networks getting in the way, they were kind of demanding it, right? So those fights, got made. He mentioned the judging. I'll tell you, big problem right now in the sport of boxing. Big problem. Two things are a big problem. Judging that is not good, and refereeing that's not good. There's a lot of referees who are either this is just a fact. There are referees that are incompetent, and there are referees that are biased. Just a fact. And the same is true of some judges, where they seem to have preconceived notions, or some that are simply not doing their job. And it's, I'm not going to make that a broad statement. Obviously, there are some fine judges and there are fine referees, but we've seen some decisions in the last year, way too many and scorecards that were handed in that aren't
What'd
even.
you think about the Michael Fox?
It's Michael. You always do that.
Michael. I'm actually the best with the names.
Not with
Hey,
his.
you had the last name right, so there you go. You're halfway there. You know what I'm saying? Hey, you didn't call me Larry Merchant, so there you go. We're good so far.
I'm good on that one.
Yeah, but that was a perfect example. That's the poster kid in a way for what's going on. And not only, and the problem with that one is were many other elements. There was the fact that it seemed that there might be some corruption involved, or at least bias. Not to mention the fact that one of the judges had, statements on social media that were way inappropriate on every level. And then the fact that the scorecards were just, a couple of the scorecards were just absurd. So, and we've had a lot of bad, the one scorecard handed in with the Castano Charlo fight we had that was shameful. It's been way too many. You can go back and find so many all during the year. It's too bad.
Okay, the next question is coming in from Brandon Maurice. He says, Tank Davis versus Subriel Matias. Who wins and why?
Oh, wow, what a fight that would be. Now, that would be at 140. Matias is at 140. Subriel Matias, and your audience is very knowledgeable, so they, I'm sure, do know him. He's a 140-pound fighter who is just a hell-bent for leather fighter who you can hit a lot, but he hits you more than you hit him. And for the most part in his career, I think he's only got one loss. And now he's kind of at, the peak of his, or approaching the peak of his abilities. Oh my God, would that be a wild affair? What might do in Matias in that fight might be his defense, but I'll tell you what, he's a danger for anybody he fights. I've never heard anyone even suggest that matchup, but
he's
it is
real durable.
Pardon?
That guy's really durable. That Maxim Dashadev fight,
Oh my gosh, yeah. And we just he just had it was amazing. So.
Got a next one that's coming in from Victor Banuelos. Says, in your opinion, how do you see the sport of boxing in 5 to 10 years if the fights we want to see continue to not happen? Sure, we get great fights here and there, but there's still many fights that haven't happened and most likely will never happen. What are your thoughts?
Well, there are some. I think we tend to exaggerate the number that don't happen because they're so important to us. Though I'm not defending the boxing hierarchy because too many fights don't get made. But sometimes like this year is a perfect example. There have been a bunch of unification matches made, a lot. There have been, major fights made. So I'm going to say a good portion of the matches we're going to see are kind of getting made now, but there are examples of ones that we just cannot seem to get made, and they're a problem. It's hard to look 5 or 10 years ahead because we don't know what the landscape's going to be in terms of the promoters that will remain in the sport and be important and the platforms that are going to be important. So it's kind of hard to look that far ahead.
All right. Yeah, the landscape's always changing. James Benitez says Plant has the gifts, quickness, reflexes, and athleticism to make any fighter look basic. Plant gonna make Canelo look average like Floyd. Tell me. Say that again.
Upset. Caleb Plant's an interesting fighter because he's had this kind of, even though he was fighting before, but in a short period he's kind of shot up the ladder, winning the title in a fight that most people didn't think he was going to win against Jose Uzcategui. I think most boxing pundits probably didn't think Plant was going to win that fight, right? And he won it.
They definitely didn't expect him to get those knockdowns.
Pardon?
They definitely did not expect him to get those knockdowns. Going into that fight, Plant was not considered a puncher. Absolutely.
And so he hasn't fought the toughest competition since then. I think we can safely say that. So we haven't really seen Caleb Plant beat a lot of top-level fighters. So we don't know what his upside is. We know that he's improved over the last 3 years. That if you look at Caleb Plant from 3 or 4 years ago and you look at Caleb Plant today, much better fighter. Definitely better on every level. He's a pure boxer for the most part, though he did show pop in that one fight. His ticket in this fight, obviously, is, as that person suggested, to box effectively, have movement, counterpunch, throw combinations, and hope that Canelo doesn't get to him with big power punches.
Do you think he can do better than Estrandli Lara?
You mean than Lara did against Canelo?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some people think Lara beat Canelo. That was a very close fight, and Lara didn't do enough offensively in that fight, I guess, to get and I announced that fight. So, it's going to be up to Plant to be a little more offensive. Erislandy Lara could have won that fight had he simply punched a little bit more. He was right there. Now, of course, it's easy to say when you're outside the ring, but if he had just done a little bit more offensively, could well have won that fight. So for Plant, the trick is to do more offensively, but not put yourself in harm's way.
Next was coming in from 40 Thief. Says, how do you see Canelo versus Plant and a potential Bud versus Ortiz going? Wishing you much success.
And what was the other one? Crawford?
And Ortiz. Virgil Ortiz?
Ortiz?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's an interesting potential fight. Ortiz he's another one of those fighters that I think is getting better every time he fights. He is, I think he's really dedicated to the sport and a hard worker, has lots of power. And, he's right there. I think he's like a half step below being 100% ready for the best welterweights in the world. Maybe there right now, and so a fight with Crawford would be intriguing because Crawford is a more skilled technician, probably, at least to some degree, with his style, which is not to suggest that Ortiz is not a good technician. He is. He just fights a slightly different style. But, it would be an interesting fight in which for Ortiz, the trick would be to be able to slow the movement of and the angles that Crawford would use and work the body very effectively in that fight. If he could somehow find a way to do that in the first portion of a fight with the Crawford, he would have he'd have a good chance.
And Canelo versus Plant.
Yeah, well, we kind of covered that one, but
yeah.
I think it's going to be. Listen, Canelo is the favorite in that fight for a reason, and it's going to be an uphill struggle for Caleb Plant. But again, if he can put it together as a boxer in that fight completely, he's going to have to fight close to a perfect fight. And part of the reason there's two problems. One, Canelo doesn't really lose decisions, does he? Not that often. So there's that kind of thing built in there. So if you're going to win this fight, you have to really make sure you have to box well and for sure win those rounds. But what Canelo sometimes does is he does give you the opportunity for that because he'll have lull periods in his boxing.
That's a serious analysis, Al. I'm telling you, man. You know boxing, brother.
Well, hey, I do my best. I'm trying.
Nah, you really, and look, and I'm not saying it from a standpoint of a lot less years than you, but man, hearing you break it down is pretty damn cool. Big Casual is saying, if Deontay Wilder is successful in the trilogy, do you think AJ versus Wilder is the biggest fight in the world, even bigger than Fury versus AJ, since Fury is basically a man with no land?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Fury's a man with no land. I guess they're saying he's not, that he isn't loved in England and isn't big enough yet in the United States. I guess that's the inference there. Well, Fury's interesting. In a way, he could be a man with no land, but a guy that has a certain kind of interesting universal appeal, right? I mean, he's such larger than life character.
Polarizing.
Right? I mean, there's so many layers to his story. Some, a little dicey, some really interesting, some I did his early fights, Tyson Fury, on Channel 5. I did the fights for a network in England, Channel 5 it's called. It's one of the over-the-air networks. And I did a lot of his early fights. I did maybe 5 Tyson Fury fights. So I was around him a lot. He's a really engaging, interesting guy when you're just hanging out with him. He's sometimes in the spotlight, he says some things that are, out there. But anyway, if Wilder can win that fight, whoever wins that fight, the fight with Joshua is going to be a monstrous fight. If Joshua beats Usyk, which we are assuming kind of he's going to do, though Usyk is a very, talented fighter. He hasn't performed that well as a heavyweight so far. But either one, it will be a massive fight for different reasons. Fury and Joshua in Europe, that fight's going to resonate in a way that is monstrous. But Wilder, who ironically has a lot of fans over there and a lot of people are interested in Deontay Wilder, clearly his fight with Joshua would be monstrous. So I don't know if you could say one or the other would be more dramatic. But the good news is that we have these major heavyweights who it appears, this is the third Wilder-Fury fight. Fury did have an agreement to fight Joshua before the court ruling that made him fight Wilder. So it's clear these heavyweights seem willing to fight each other.
All right. Next was coming in from Brandon Lenz, who says, this past weekend, Guillermo Rigondeaux took a lot of heat for his performance, but I thought he won the fight easily by making Casemiro land more punches on the ropes than on him. Do you think the extreme critiques of Rigondeaux's style was warranted?
Those two big margins for Casemiro, I guess maybe people could look at that and say, did he do enough offensively to win those rounds, or were those scores penalizing Rigondeaux for doing so little, right? I mean, not that these numbers are sacrosanct, but the CompuBox company that does show stats, that was the lowest number of punches landed by two fighters in the history of CompuBox.
Wow.
Okay, that's astonishing. It was like 98 punches, I think, for two fighters to land in a 12-round fight, the lowest ever, and I think the lowest by a considerable margin. So clearly neither man got much done offensively. In the case of Casemiro, it was because he had a hard time cutting off the ring, couldn't get to Rigondeaux. And even when Rigondeaux did pause, because you're still wary of his counterpunching, maybe Casemiro at that point was kind of transfixed and didn't get as much done as he needed to. That was a very difficult fight to score, difficult to announce, a difficult fight period. And, of all, I have great respect for Rigondeaux's boxing ability. I think Casemiro is a fun fighter to watch 99% of the time. But that was the most defensive fight Rigondeaux has fought. I think almost as much as we know he's a defensive fighter.
Pure defense.
Yeah, that was way more defensive and way more movement than we've seen from him. So, it is what it is. And he paid the price for it. And Ronnie Shields kept telling him in between rounds, you have to do more because they might be not scoring it for you.
Jeff Gorley is the next up on the Patreon questions. He says, "Hey Al, I'm a big fan. I believe Castillo Clayton is the best welterweight in boxing. Can you get him on your podcast? It would be great exposure for him. Thanks."
Yeah, I would like to interview Castillo Clayton. He had a good fight with Sergey Lipinets. He's a Canadian fighter, very solid fighter. Is he on the level of the top welterweights? I don't think we know that yet. But I would love to see him get the opportunity to fight some of the better welterweights. He acquitted himself well in the Lipinets fight. I think it ended up being a draw, but Clayton could have easily gotten the decision. Lipinets, a good welterweight, better at 140, so he would, he's not in the upper echelon of welterweights, but I like Castillo Clayton. He's a good fighter.
I'll segue real quick. A question from me, Ness. Al, I just want to know if you were familiar with the welterweight Jaron Ennis, and if you are, what do you think about the champ? What do you think he's bringing into the future in the welterweight division?
Yeah, I've done several of his recent fights. I did the Lipinets fight, and he is a force of nature offensively. Offensively, he's as dynamic as any fighter I've seen in many years. Okay, and I say that specifically because the thing we don't know, because he hasn't, the best fighter he's faced is Lipinets, who's a good, decent 147 pounder, but Boots Ennis hasn't had the opportunity yet to face the highest echelon of the welterweight division. Offensively, he's right there. And I'm not saying he's not good defensively, and I'm not saying he can't take a good punch. We just don't know the answer to that. Now, some of the defensive ability he has is he overwhelms you with so much offense that, the best defense is a good offense in this case. So Jaron Ennis is an interesting case study because you could look at all of boxing, and I'm not sure you'll find a fighter like him, right? Switching from lefty to righty, throwing all kinds of creative combinations, punching with power. From an offensive standpoint, it's possible, and I say possible, that he's the best offensive fighter in boxing.
Woo! Let's go, champ.
Could be as he moves forward. From purely an offensive standpoint, I don't know too many people that do what he does, right? If you take that and separate it from everything else.
I'm totally with you, and I'm pretty sure a lot of the TBV fans listening are with you right now.
I haven't seen anything I really like when I do my analysis, I call him my double star athlete. I've never seen anything, I'm trying to see, but it's different.
And, it doesn't mean he's going to be undefeated. It doesn't mean that he's going to be the greatest fighter in the sport of boxing. He could be, but what it means is he has the potential to do things like that, because we see this astonishing hand speed, lots of power, and great athleticism. If you have all that, man, you got a chance to, and now his biggest issue is trying to get someone to fight him in the next year or so.
All right, that was the last of the Patreon questions. Next,
well, I just want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a great interview, and please give out your social media and podcast once again. so that everybody who isn't following obviously can follow and subscribe to the podcast. We've already had some live people in the chat saying they've subscribed to your podcast. So, yeah, man, thank you again for coming on the program.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Folks can talk to me at Al Bernstein on Twitter. And as you said, Al Bernstein Unplugged. I appreciate the folks who are jumping on there to subscribe. It's been fun to do it, and a lot of fun to visit with you guys. I'm glad we worked it out.
Appreciate you taking out the time, Al. Thank you for coming on. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Al Bernstein. Till the next one.
Yo, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like, subscribe, and share. As always, if you want to support us to the next level, head over to the patreon.com/ThaBoxingVoice. We have tons of exclusive from Border Wars, Untitled, betting shows, the list goes on and on and on. But in addition to that, if you guys have questions for fighters, trainers, and promoters, this is where you can submit them. We will run out, get these questions answered, and put it back on the show just for you guys. Appreciate it. Peace.